B-U-B-O-N-I-C. Alright, we're going to pause right there with Gwen and start with our lecture. So you need a sheet of paper. You'll be taking notes on the Black Death. For this lecture, let's do this. Anytime I say notes at the beginning of a slide, you need to take the notes from that page. If I don't say it, that was awesome. This is adopted from Susan Poger, a colleague of mine who created this PowerPoint, and I modified it. So let's begin. Notes. This is your lesson objective. You need to write this down on the left side. Explain why Europe was so susceptible. I'm going to try to help you out and move this so I'm not in the way. Alright, pausing. Write down your lesson objective. Alright, we're back. I'm sorry, I'm still slightly in the way there, but explain why Europe was so susceptible to disease in the 14th century and how the Black Death began. So that will guide all of our notes. Oh. Come on. PowerPoint. Oh, there we go. The culprits. I didn't say notes. You don't have to take any notes. It begins as a small bacteria formation. It infects the fleas, and then the fleas bite the rats. It is then in turn transferred onto ships and other places through the rats who carry the fleas, and then the fleas who now carry the disease bite the humans as well. Background. Notes. The famine of 1315 to 1317. So 30 years before the plague reaches Italy and other parts of Western Europe, there are some issues, and we're going to cover those. By the 1300s, Europeans were farming almost all the land they could cultivate. This is a problem because when you run out of farmlands, well, you don't have food. But up until that point, they've got more people, a population crisis, because they have so much food, and they're running out of land. Climate changes in Europe at the same time. Europe has 3 years of bad crops. So once the crops failure, you got the opposite problem. Not enough food because of excessive rain and floods. As many as 15% of the peasants in some English villages died even before the plague began. The biggest problem besides starvation and poverty was they are now susceptible to disease. So you think about it, you're hungry, you haven't eaten, your immune system breaks down, and now any disease you are much more likely to contract. So make sure you have all those notes on the right side. 1347, plague reaches Genoa, Italy. I didn't say notes, you don't need to take notes, but what happens? These are major trade routes, right? Silk and spices are coming from the east, China and other parts of Southeast Asia, and they go through the Black Sea onto Constantinople, where the Ottomans take a tax, and they also didn't know it, but they were taking the disease in through Constantinople. After that, the ship continued on its way. Some ships went down here to Egypt, to Alexandria, other ships over here to parts of Italy, and it reaches Venice and Genoa on January 1348 it reaches Venice and Genoa, but even earlier, 1347, it reaches other port cities of Italy, and the plague has now reached Western Europe through the Italian port cities that were very important for trade. Challenge question, why would it reach Constantinople first? Make this a side note, please. Side note. Think about this. The major trade routes for silk and spice, the most trade goods at the time, came from Asia. Well, and Constantinople is on the way, so I gave you the answer. Constantinople is the way the ships had to come. The disease cycle. Flea drinks rat blood that carries the bacteria. Then, the bacteria multiplies in the flea's gut. The bacteria grows and reproduces and splits. It becomes more bacteria. Flea's gut clogged with bacteria now. Flea bites humans and regurgitates blood into human wound, and human is infected. Disgusting! You didn't need to write that down, but interesting to know. The symptoms. You don't need to write this down either. So it shows up first as this thing called a bulbus. Gwen Stefani in the song referred to it as a bulba. Same thing. Bulbus would be plural, multiple bulba. That is the early form, and it's treatable. Once it reaches the septicemic form, almost 100% mortality rate. You see, this is a symptom, what looks like frostbite on the fingers here. That's an indication that you've reached septicemic form, and most likely you will not survive. Lancing a bubo. I don't know how to say that, to be honest with you. Bubo, I think. This was actually one of the few effective practices for treating the plague. We'll talk about other ones that were not effective at all. You got to keep in mind the education behind medicine was very lacking. It was wrong. I mean, they just didn't have the medical education we have today, so they tried some very strange things. But this one worked. You would pierce the buba. I'm saying that wrong. And anyways, you would pierce it, and you would drain it essentially, and this would potentially save your life if this was done early before it turned into the septicemic form. Other attempts to stop the plague were not as effective, so it was believed that leeching would work. A leech was placed on the skin, and that would suck the blood out, and they thought if they got rid of the bad blood, they would get rid of the disease. That's not true at all. That's not the way it works. Another practice which is very strange, which you'll see in your reading, was the use of doctors who would come around by the 17th century, the 1600s. This was a common thing. The doctors would wear this robe. And I'm looking in your reading here now, but I'm not on the right page. Anyways, you'll see this, and you'll get to read more about it in your reading. Other treatments. Flagellenti. This is one of the strangest things. So, self-inflicted punishment for our sins. Notes. Please write this down. Flagellenti are the people who believe that this was a punishment. The plague was a punishment from God for their sins. And the only way to fix the problem was to suffer themselves greater in order to win God's favor again. So what they would do is they would whip themselves until they bled. The problem is that they were spreading the disease even more, because as blood is flying all over the place, they don't have the sanitary practices to clean up, so they're actually spreading the disease. So flagellance was a very ineffective practice, and it wasn't a huge group of people. It was a small group of radical religious people. Other attempts to stop the plague. Pogroms against the Jews. The Jews at this time were persecuted in Europe, especially for reasons we will talk about in a second, but I want to show you some art and relate it to something you've already studied. So the golden badge here, the golden circle, was an obligatory badge that Jews had to wear during this time period. Probably sounds very familiar to the Star of David, which we studied when the Nazis made Jews identify themselves wearing the Star of David. You see there's a continuation here in history of persecution towards the Jews, and also of identifying Jews through certain means. Another thing, the media. Remember, the Nazis were masters of propaganda using the media, but that wasn't a new thing. The way it was done was new, because there were new media forms, but still done in older art like this piece here that shows a Jew hat. How to identify a Jew is the idea. Scapegoat. So why the Jews? Let's talk about this. This is the same term used after the Holocaust to describe the Jews. Alright, sorry, I got interrupted for 1 second. Scapegoat. The term applied to someone who is blamed for something, someone who blame is placed upon. So the Jews during the time of the Holocaust, we talked about that term, scapegoat. They were used as the people who blame was placed on for things that happened during World War I and the Great Depression. Now they're blamed for what's happening with the Black Death. There's a number of reasons for this, and it's a long history, but to shorten it, one, they're a small minority. It's easier for the larger group to target the minority group, both religiously and ethnically in the case of the Jews. Another thing that's very important when we talk about Jewish history, they'd achieved great wealth and status in many parts of Europe by this point, and I'm going to argue that people were jealous of the success the Jews had, and because they were a different group, a religious and ethnic minority, it was easy to target them, and then after these pogroms, after they attacked the Jews, they could then take their wealth and make it their own, which is wrong and horrible, but that's what happened. Okay, let's look at the progress of the plague. So it comes from the east like we talked about, and that's in 1347. It finally reaches these port cities first. So you can see the way it traveled. It came through the Black Sea, through the Mediterranean, and then by 1348, June, it has reached the main port cities of Italy, and from that point it spreads, and by 1349 it's reached Portugal, the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire, Hungary, England, Ireland, and then by 1350 the northernmost regions, Scotland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and on and on. I am going to stop right here, and we will begin with medieval art and the plague in class, but I want to set you up now for your reading notes. So I'm going to pause and keep these notes separate. So these will be Black Plague lecture notes, and then you're going to take a new sheet of paper out, and I'll go over in 1 second with you your Black Plague reading notes. Alright, we are back. I want to go over your reading with you. So you need this, your study and reading guide for Unit 1. You need Edmodo available. And on Edmodo, you'll find the Black Death reading, which I posted. It's this smallpdf.com. So pull that up, and it will take you to the reading, hopefully. Well, I know it will. I did it on your iPad. But on my computer here, it's not showing up. So that'll load. While that's loading, let me take you through this. So this was our first lesson objective. We will go over that next class. This was our lesson objective for the High Middle Ages lecture, and what you're working with is the first lesson objective here. Explain why Europe was so susceptible to disease in the 14th century. It's the same lesson objective from your class lecture, but I want you to start on a new page. So this is your lesson objective for pages 325 to 330. So what you need to do is take this, insert it in your notes there, take all the notes that go with this for pages 325 to 330 here, and then when you finish, you're going to start on where you left off on page 330, but you have a new lesson objective. It's this one: describe how the plague, Black Death, reshaped European society, religious life, and economics, and that's for pages 330 to 332 in the reading. So after you've taken all the notes for the first objective, you put the second objective in, and then you start taking notes for that section. Okay? So that's it. That's what you need to do for the reading. I'm not going to save that. Is not showing up here. But on your iPad, I'm sure it will show up. If you have any issues, please email me. It worked earlier on my iPad. You should be fine. If you have any questions, forward me a message on Edmodo. Alright, I am out. I am signing off. I am going to a coffee shop to drink coffee and grade some of your work. Good night.